Good afternoon and welcome everyone. It is now 2:30, so I think we'll get started. I am Ed Reeves, and I'm the Social Sciences Librarian at Northeastern Illinois University Library, and I'd like to begin by thanking the Northeastern Illinois University Department of History for co-sponsoring and supporting our event today. We're here for a lecture and discussion with Dave Beck. Dave Beck is an award-winning historian who has published several books on American Indian history, including Unfair Labor, American Indians, and the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, as well as the book City Indian, Native American Activists in Chicago, 1893 to 1934, which he co-authored with Rosalind Lapierre. He is currently working on a book about the 1950s federal policy of terminating the political status of tribal nations, and he's a professor in the Native American Studies Department at the University of Montana. So in terms of the format of today's event, Dave will be presenting a slide presentation, and after that, I'll moderate audience Q&A. So if you have a question during Dave's lecture, please type it in the chat box, and then I will pose the questions as they're typed in the chat box to Dave after he finishes delivering his presentation. And you can also feel free to type a question in the chat box during the Q&A itself, which I'll mention again once we kick off the Q&A. And then after that, we'll continue taking questions from audience members. And when we're finished with that, I'll draw the event to a close. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dave Beck to Northeastern Illinois University. Thank you, Dave, for joining us today.
Thanks, Ed, for having me. I'm really pleased to be here. I was actually scheduled to give this talk a year ago. Ed had asked me to come to Northeastern and speak in the library right before COVID broke out. And so we put it off, and I'm really pleased to be able to do it in this format. Last time I was at Northeastern was when I came and talked about City Indian with my co-author, Rosalind Lapierre. We had a great time there. One of the advantages of doing it this way, of course, is seeing all of you who are from different places who are not in Chicago, who are able to be here. So that's really kind of special. I want to give a special shout out to my students who are here, who obviously wouldn't have been able to attend if I was in Chicago, and to the students at Fort Peck Community College who may be here on the Zoom link as well. I'm going to share my screen because I have a slideshow, and then I'll come back. Oh yeah, my brother's here, and he's a proud graduate of Northeastern Illinois. I thought I'd better mention that. Let me share my screen, and it'll just take me a second to get going here, and then I'll start my talk. Okay, looks like I can't quite get rid of my camera, but the talk I'm giving today is called Working for Cash, and it's about American Indians who worked for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair in Chicago. I'm going to be talking about both people who earned money working for the fair before it happened in the years leading up to the fair and during the fair itself. This is a talk that is derived from the book that Ed mentioned at the beginning here, Unfair Labor, with a question mark in the title. And so one of the things I was thinking about when I was working on this book was to what extent were American Indians compensated fairly for the work that they did at the 1893 fair? Normally, I would recognize that there at Northeastern, you're on the land of the Potawatomi people and the Miami people, and the dozens and even more than 100 American Indian tribal people who have made Chicago their home. But I'm coming to you from Missoula, Montana, which is the home of the Bitterroot Salish. And this is a place where which is their historic homeland and is also their present homeland and their future homeland. So I think it's important when we think about where we are to think about the people who were here first and the people who have been here since. I grew up in Evanston, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. I actually did my graduate work at University of Illinois at Chicago, did my undergraduate work at Northwestern University. So it was kind of pleasing for me to be able to write about some Chicago history, which I've done now in 2 of my books. And from 1986 until 2000, when I moved out here to Missoula, I worked at an American Indian college in Chicago, Nace College, which was over there on Peterson Avenue, not far from where Northeastern is. My first job there was as an archivist. And my job was to gather material about the Chicago Indian community and American Indians in Chicago for their archives. Most of those documents are now at the University of Chicago archives. But I began to be interested then in the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. And as time went on, I thought about the exposition in different ways and over and over. And as you'll see from my talk here, it turned into a history that was kind of a labor and economic history, which was kind of a new way to approach understanding the 1893 fair. The fair occurred at a time when the socioeconomic conditions in Indian country were just in a really, really bad place. The bison were gone from the plains. Almost all American Indian nations in the United States had lost the vast majority of their lands and resources to American colonialism and expansion. People were on the verge of starvation. The federal government created a policy to confiscate the reservation lands from many tribal communities and kind of dole them out to individuals to try and farm on. And so even the reservation lands that had been set aside for Native nations were no longer sacrosanct. And so all this led to great hardship. At the same time, Indian children were taken from their homes, sometimes kidnapped, sometimes sent away by their parents to boarding schools, some of which were on reservations, some of which were far away from reservation communities, which really disrupted family life. The federal government decided that American Indians shouldn't be able to practice their own religions and began outlawing religious practices that weren't Christian-based. And tribes lost just about all of their political authority as their economic situation really sank to a low level. And so one of the things that came out of this was a situation where many families couldn't even feed their parents couldn't even feed their children. It was very difficult to get food. And so even when American Indians had money at this time, it wasn't money that they actually controlled. Many, both individuals and tribal communities' money went into the US Treasury, and American Indian people had to ask for that money from the Indian agent, sometimes beg for that money, and sometimes they'd get it and sometimes they wouldn't. And so people began to look for other ways to make money. Now, another thing to think about in terms of this history is that this is a time when the larger American society thought that American Indians were kind of vanishing from the face of the earth, which this well-known statue here was supposed to represent. The concept for that statue came to the artist just the year after the World's Fair. American Indians were largely viewed as people of the past, not people of the present, not people of the future. Were viewed as not having any power, either economically or in terms of determining their own future. Nonetheless, during these late 1800s, early 1900s, American Indians began to participate in the cash economy in a wide variety of ways, where tribal communities were near farms. People did agricultural work. In the Northwest, they picked hops or they worked in the cranberry bogs. In California, Native people did agricultural work. In the Midwest, in Michigan and Wisconsin, Native people did agricultural work so that they could earn cash money, so that they could spend the money on what they wanted to and not what the federal Indian agents told them that they had to. People worked in forestry, logging industry, in mining industries. Some jobs took a great deal of skill, including the steel workers, the Mohawk steel workers, who beginning in the 1850s kind of built the infrastructure of New York City. Native people who had been to boarding school and who had learned the skills of, for example, fixing wagon wheels, became freighters, hauling goods to and from reservations. And some people made a living by selling artwork and cultural objects and material objects that they made. The people who sold those things were the targets of the collectors to build the collections that were exhibited at the fair and that became kind of the basis of the collections in our modern natural history museums. People also who had knowledge would tell stories, oftentimes in their tribal languages, and share their traditional knowledge and get paid for that. So there were different ways where people entered the cash economy through necessity and through choice. Like I said, I became interested in studying the 1893 fair way back in the 1980s and started doing a little bit of research on it then, although it wasn't until recently that I really paid close attention to it. And there are a couple of things when the World's Fair was, when American Indians at the World's Fair have been written about. There are a couple of things that have been the focus of the scholarly literature. And one is the development of the field of anthropology. In the late 1800s, the field itself was a new field, and it was initially something where people wanted to do anthropological work. They found a wealthy patron who gave them money, and they'd go do the work. And it was right around the time of the World's Fair that universities and museums began to professionalize anthropology. So that's been the subject of some of the work on the fair. And when American Indians at the fair were written about, mostly they were written about in regards to the way that they were stereotyped in the displays that they were put on and presented as people of the past, and to an even smaller extent, how they responded to that. And so one of the things that I'm interested in doing is looking at this from a different perspective. Let's see, where am I next? Yeah, I'll stay on this slide for a second because I want you to look at this ticket to the fair. The people who organized the fair viewed American Indians as people of the past, not as people of the modern world. And so did those who brought Indian exhibits to the fair. And so one of the things they did was they printed the tickets that you purchased to get into the fair, and they actually had 4 different designs on the tickets. And this is one of the designs. And another design was of Columbus, and there was one that had George Washington, and there was one that had Abraham Lincoln. And so the tickets were supposed to show Columbus discovering America. This was a year late, but it was celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus coming to the Americas, which is why they called it the Columbian Exposition. The ticket with George Washington represented their fact that we were a new country. Abraham Lincoln, that we freed the slaves, which was somewhat ironic considering how African and African-American people were mistreated by the fair organizers. And then this particular ticket, the ticket with the American Indian on it, was supposed to be an image that, and this is a quote from the fair organizers, that portrays, quote, that period when the country was entirely under the dominion of the savage. And so you can see that the way they thought about American Indians were definitely as peoples of the past. And so in writing about American Indians in this World's Fair, most scholars just virtually ignored the fact that they were working for, the people were working for money, and that the economy and economics were an important issue to the American Indian people here. In fact, there's been very little labor history of the fair at all, which is kind of odd considering that Chicago was such a hotbed of labor organizing during that time period. And in fact, when we look at the way that people created the exhibits at the fair and participated in the exhibits at the fair, it turns out that it's much more complex than the standard interpretation. The standard interpretation has kind of been a binary interpretation. This is what I wrote about it. Scholarly work on the role of Indians at the fair have largely pursued a binary analysis. Following long-standing interpretations of American Indians, they describe the displays as depicting Indians either as primitivistic or, in relation to the Indian school displays, progressive. So they looked at Indians either as assimilating into American society or as people of the past. And if you look at the ways that the fair was organized around the Indian exhibits, you can really break it down into 5 different representations of Indians that kind of competed with each other. And one was just simply Indians as objects of scientific study. The main organizer who brought Indian villages to the fair and organized many of the Indian exhibits was an anthropologist whose idea was that anthropologists from the world over would come to study Indians as kind of objects of the past. There was also a boarding school that was established on the fairgrounds where Native children came to the boarding school and spent time there. And that was supposed to kind of show the competing perspective. So on the one hand, there was an Indian village where people were supposed to go see what Indians looked like in the past, and then they just walk a little ways down and see the Indian school where the school teachers were assimilating Indians into the modern world. So that both federal officials and the fair organizers viewed those 2 exhibits as kind of being related to each other. Some of the representation of American Indians presented kind of a really romanticized version of Indians of the past, and other representations of Indians presented them as kind of a more savage or wild representation of the past. And in relation to all this, American Indians themselves wanted to define how they were represented at the fair. And one of the more well-known commentaries was by a Potawatomi man from Michigan whose family had lived where Chicago is up until the 1833 treaty, Simon Pokagon. And he wrote a little booklet that was distributed on the fairgrounds. He initially called it the Red Man's Rebuke, and then he changed the name because he wanted to have a wider readership, I think, and called it the Red Man's Greeting. And it was printed on birch bark and was kind of a popular item for sale. And in it, he wrote this kind of lengthy quote that I've got on the screen here. In behalf of my people, the American Indians, I hereby declare to you, the pale-faced race that has usurped our lands and homes, that we have no spirit to celebrate with you the great Columbian Fair now being held in this Chicago city, the wonder of the world. No, sooner would we hold high joy day over the graves of our departed fathers than to celebrate our own funeral, the discovery of America. And so he was really lamenting the way that American Indians were being treated in society. And his writing caught the eye of the mayor of the city of Chicago at the time, who invited him to work together to kind of create a better representation of American Indians. The mayor himself was murdered during the time the fair was going, so it never happened. Simon Pokagon was not the only individual who protested the way that Indians were viewed and treated. A Pine Ridge Lakota man, Henry Standing Bear, wrote a letter to the commissioner of the fair saying about his people that they wanted to attend the fair and participate in the fair and show the world who they were. And he said, quote, "They want to come as men and not like cattle driving to the show. Before the public, they want to bring some impression that they are men and respectable. If they should come to the fair, they do not wish Buffalo Bills or some government scout or any other party who will misrepresent our race." And so there were, those were just a couple of examples. There are numerous other examples of American Indian people who really opposed the way that they would be showed at the fair. And there were other Native people who wanted to attend the fair and present themselves as part of modern society. There were quite a few people who were left out who were not permitted to come to the fair, but I think it's worth looking at who they were just in terms of the representation that they wanted to bring. The fair organizers were really focused on presenting Indians as people of the past. There was a territory in the United States, which now is much of Oklahoma, and it was actually called Indian Territory, which had tribes who had been removed from the east into that area living there. And they wanted to come to the fair and set up their own exhibit showing the world that they were modern people. And they were unable to do so because they couldn't get permission. And the reason they couldn't get permission is because there was no governor of that territory, and any exhibits or representatives who came to the fair had to be appointed by a territorial governor, and they couldn't come as Indians because they were part of Indian territory and not, they were kind of in this netherland between being a separate nation. The State Department said they couldn't come, they weren't part of a state, and they weren't part of a recognized territory. There were a couple of groups of people, you can see the locations on this map, Seneca people from New York and Santee Sioux people from Nebraska who had brass bands. They wanted to bring their brass bands to play at the fair. There were many other exhibits like that where people came and played music. They weren't permitted to come because the fair organizers didn't think of brass bands as representing Indians before Columbus came. Even a lacrosse team from the Mohawk Reserve, the Ganawagi Mohawk Reserve, wasn't permitted to come because they were told they were, quote unquote, too civilized to participate in the fair as Indians. Nonetheless, there was widespread participation in the fair by all kinds of Indian people, both before and after the fair was held. And so I'm going to talk about kind of these four different categories, and two of them take place before the fair and two take place during the fair. Before the fair, there was a massive collection of material objects for displays and recruitment of people to come participate in the fair and be kind of viewed in Indian villages as peoples of the past. And so I'm going to talk about some of the work that people did before the fair was actually established or began. And then I'm going to talk about what happened after the fair was opened, both on the fairgrounds and off the fairgrounds. So there was a great deal of collecting that went on by ethnologists and early archaeologists and anthropologists. And the bulk of it was done through a department known as the Department of Ethnology, which was an official department of the fair. And that collecting was done under the leadership of Frederic, Putnam, and Franz Boas. But there were other places that also, other organizations and institutions that also sent collectors out into the field to collect material objects to put on display. The Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. did. The Canadian government set aside some money to collect from Indian communities to collect material objects. Some of the states for their state displays did this. And some of the people who did the collecting became very well-known anthropologists in the early 20th century. As I mentioned, Frederic Putnam from Harvard was the main organizer of the Indian exhibits. And he took a leave of absence from Harvard for a year and a half to organize and put on the displays at the fair. And he had kind of three different things he was in charge of. And one was the ethnology building, which he filled with artifacts collected from all over the hemisphere from Native communities. Another thing he did when he sent the collectors out is he had people take all kinds of measurements of Indians, of their skulls, of their faces, of their arms. At the time, scientists were trying to classify people by race, looking at things like skull size. And so there was a significant amount of this kind of work that they tried to do. And then he also organized an ethnological exhibit where several tribes came and set up their homes on the grounds at the fair. He hired Franz Boas, and together they hired more than 100 people who went into tribal communities and collected these material objects. Many of them were Boas's students, many of them were budding archaeologists, but three of them were American Indian people who were brought in to collect. They at the time thought they had included 4 American Indians, but one was an imposter. And one was a Tuscarora man who was from a well-known family. His family was connected strongly to the British and the Americans from before the Revolutionary War. They were, even before his time, they were interested in ethnology. They were friends with Henry Rose Schoolcraft and with John James Audubon, who would visit their home regularly. So from an early age, he had an interest in kind of ethnology and collecting things. He became a captain in the right after the Civil War. He joined the military and he became a captain. He fought in some of the wars out west. And it turned out that Putnam wanted to hire him actually to oversee all the Indian collecting initially, but he wasn't permitted to hire him because Cusick was a military man and he was on a military salary. And so there was a legal reason that he couldn't be paid to do the work. And he actually quit his post in the military and volunteered to collect. And he went to the different Haudenosaunee or Iroquois nations and collected material goods from there and recruited people who were interested in attending the fair. One of the villages that one of the native villages that Putnam set up was an Iroquois village that was sponsored by the state of New York. And to a large degree, the people who came for that probably came because Cornelius Cusick had visited them for the 2 years leading up to the fair and encouraged them to come and purchase material objects that were displayed in the fair. All the way on the other side of the continent in Canada, among the Kwakwaka'wakw people was a man named George Hunt. He had been working with Franz Boas in the years before the fair, and he was hired to collect material objects. He collected some 360 items, some of them very large, sent them back in numerous railroad cars to Chicago. These objects he purchased from the people who sold them. So the people in the community who made objects out of wood and made clothing and made fishing gear and all the different things that he purchased were paid for that work. And in the Northwest Coast, at that time already, the cash economy had become part of the world of the indigenous peoples in British Columbia and even down into Washington. And so they were pretty savvy about their marketing. And so they got paid market value for the things that they sold. And many of those things then ended up in the Field Museum in Chicago and were kind of the basis of the initial Field Museum collections. George Hunt went on to become a pretty well-known ethnologist. He gave one of his first professional papers at the Anthropology Congress that was held as part of the fair, and he worked with Boas throughout his career. He also brought 14 other people from Kwakwaka'u people from the Northwest Coast to the fair, and he was paid to kind of bring them there and to be in charge of them. They were all paid $20 a month when they came to the fair and worked, and he was paid $90 a month for his kind of leadership in that. Another Northwest Coast Native person was a woman named Odille Morison, who was best known for her linguistic work, but she was paid $100 in the year before the fair to collect material objects from the Tsimshian people and to send those to the fair. And she collected 140 different things and sent them for the display at the fair. And those too then became part of the Field Museum's collections. The individual I mentioned who was an imposter was a guy named Antonio, and Putnam took him under his wing and thought he was really training a young Indian guy to become an ethnologist or an anthropologist. But it turned out later on after the fair, it was found out that he was actually not Indian. He was an imposter pretending to be Indian. So in this case, Putnam thought he had also hired another American Indian individual. He basically paid Antonio's expenses when he went out and collected from people, and then he gave money to purchase the goods that people made and sold from their homes in the Southwest where Antonio collected. And then when Antonio came and worked on the fairgrounds, he was paid a salary. Some of the other collecting, as I mentioned, was done by the Smithsonian. James Mooney, Walter Hoffman, Frank Cushing, some people who became well-known anthropologists, did significant amount of collecting for the fair. And when they did that, those objects ended up in the Smithsonian Institution displays. And again, these were objects that when they collected them, they went out and purchased them. And one of the things that to keep in mind is that for people in tribal communities, different tribal communities were in very different circumstances in terms of the modern economy at this time. So like I mentioned, the Northwest Coast people were already very savvy in the market economy and charged going rates for their material objects. People in other communities were just beginning to participate in the market economy, oftentimes sold their material objects for significantly less than they should have been paid for them. Some people were in very desperate circumstances and accepted whatever they could get for selling their material goods. So some things were paid for at a significant cost, and some things were paid for very, very inexpensively. So some people made pretty good money selling objects before the fair, and some people barely made enough money to keep themselves going. And of course, the people who were sent out by people like Boas and Putnam were instructed to get things as cheaply as they could. So they were always trying to drive the price down. So it became a real process of negotiation. Many of the people, some of the people who collected, I'm on the last bullet point here now. Some of the people who collected knew the protocols for working in tribal communities that were appropriate. They would bring gifts when they came, and then they would sit down and get to know people and create relationships to buy and sell. Other people had no idea, especially some of the students had no idea what the protocols were, and sometimes were just basically kicked out of tribal communities. sometimes were chased out of tribal communities. One man was shot when he was trying to measure some people at one of the reservation communities in Indian Territory. And so there were all kinds of different experiences that people had in that way. So the people who made money at home were obviously those who made the material objects and sold them. And in many tribal communities by this time, there were kind of two classes of material objects that were being made. Those that were very, very skilled artwork and beadwork, sometimes that were used for ceremonial purposes or made specifically for museum collectors who would pay a good price for them. And then there were a lot of really inexpensively, quickly thrown together beading projects, for example, that were made for the tourist trade and weren't considered high art. So people making both those kinds of things were able to sell those, and people were also able to sell objects that they'd had in their family and either needed money or no longer had use for. And so they could sometimes would sell things that were older and weren't just specifically made for the market. People who had knowledge were able to make money, sometimes as cultural mediators, sometimes as guides. Many of the collectors had to hire guides to take them to the communities, hire interpreters who could interpret from the whichever native language it was into the English language. And in some cases, even people were paid to tell stories that became part of the displays at the museum. So there were a variety of different people who made money at home all across the hemisphere, including in South and Central America, in Canada, in Mexico, and in the United States. The woman in the photograph here is a Blackfoot woman who was an especially skilled artist, Mrs. Oldson, who was commissioned and paid to paint a teepee lodge for the display that the Canadian government purchased. So she was paid by the Canadian government to create a teepee for the display in the Canadian building. So even in the 2 years leading up to the fair, there were all kinds of ways that Native people were beginning to earn cash money in preparation for the fair. And then once the fair began, Native people came and worked on the fairgrounds. And so there were, as I mentioned, several different displays that were displays of Native people. And some of those were the displays that Putnam had organized for the Ethnology Museum, and some of them were just purely commercial displays. And the commercial displays of all kinds on the fair were held on the Midway Plaisance. For those of you in Chicago, that's kind of where that open land is by University of Chicago. There's that kind of open parkway land there. And you can see it on this map jutting out west from the fairgrounds. And almost at the very western edge, the fourth display on the top, number 4, is where an American Indian village was. And this was an American Indian village that was brought in by a commercial entrepreneur from Wisconsin who hired Dakota people and hired Ho-Chunk people and hired Ojibwe people to come down and set up a village, and he charged people money to come in and see the village. And we don't know how much they were paid, but they were paid. And at some point they were dissatisfied with how much they were paid. And they kind of went on strike and got $1.50 a week per person raise. So we don't know what the raise was from, but they were able to improve the amount of money they were getting once they learned how much money that T.R. Roddy, who brought them in, was making. So that was one of the displays on the Midway, and this is from a magazine called Puck, and this is kind of how the popular press presented the Indians who were displayed on the Midway Plaisance, although this is probably more likely Indians who came as part of Buffalo Bill's show. And another display on the Midway was Sitting Bull's cabin. One of Sitting Bull's cabins was brought fully from the West and set up on the fairgrounds, and different Lakota people lived in the cabin, and people who were at the fair would pay to come in and visit the cabin and walk through the cabin and meet the native people who were there. I don't believe those individuals were paid to be there. They got their room and board, and they were able to sell objects that they made. So Rain in the Face had a niece who was there who made artwork and sold it to make a little money while she was there on the Midway at the fair. This is a group of Native people at the front of this parade line who were part of the exhibit in Roddy's Indian exhibit on the Midway Plaisance. So they were paid to not only be in their village, but also to sometimes participate in other events on the fairgrounds. Another group of people who came to the fair to make money were Native Hawaiian people. And there were several different proposed Hawaiian exhibits, and there were actually two different groups of people who came to the fair. One was the quartet, a very well-known quartet of singers. King Kalakaua's favorite quartet it was. The man in the picture on the right here, William Aiko, was one of the best known of the quartet. They were brought to bring interest to a kind of a cyclorama display of Mount Kilauea. And they regularly sang. They worked from 8 in the morning till 11 at night every day, singing and bringing tour. This was another display on the Midway Plaisance, and people paid a ticket to get into the fair, but when they went to the Midway, they paid another nickel or 10 cents or 25 cents to go into an exhibit. So the quartet was kind of set up outside the exhibit to attract people, so they'd come pay to go in and see the exhibit. These individuals were paid $50 a month each for their work at the fair. And then a group of hula dancers came to the fair as well. You can see Kinik Pahu, who was also known as Jenny Wilson. She eventually married the man who would become the mayor of Honolulu. And she came to the fair. When these Native Hawaiian individuals came to the fair was right around the time when the American businessmen in Hawaii overthrew the kingdom and overthrew the queen. But she had to get permission from the queen in order to come to the fair. And she just wanted to come. She wanted to come for the adventure of it. She wanted to make a little bit of money, but she was more interested just in attending the fair and coming to Chicago. And quite a few Native people who came to the fair, even if they were there to earn money, were also there to experience the larger world and to kind of show people who they were as well. You can see the contrasting photographs of her here. She's in her Sunday best in the picture on the right, and then she's dressed up for what she called the ballyhoo, where she and the woman with her would play the ukulele and sing songs to get people to come into the exhibit. And then they'd go into the exhibit and put on a dance every hour, a hula dance. This is a traditional Hawaiian dance, and it's worth mentioning that on the one hand, tourists thought they were coming in and seeing something really exotic and kind of titillating. And on the other hand, the people who were doing it were able to kind of continue their cultural practices here in a way where they were getting paid to do it. There was also a Hawaiian national band that the same organizer who had set up the cyclorama wanted to bring to the fair, and they ended up not coming. He offered them 25% of the proceeds that they would bring in order to pay them. And they were family men. All the band members were men. They were family men who wanted to be able to support their families. So they kind of demanded a regular salary. And they were never clear whether the 25% they would get paid would be from the money that came in or from the money that came in after expenses. And they were just afraid that they were going to be cheated. And so they just said, no, we're not going to do it. It's just not worth our time. So they were paying very careful attention to the labor issues that they were involved in as well. So here you can see on this map, the exhibits on the fairgrounds that weren't on the Midway Plaisance, where people worked. I'll start by talking just briefly about Guatemala and Canada. Guatemala was one of the national exhibits where they introduced coffee and tried to get Americans to start to drink coffee. And the Guatemalan government hired Mayan women to serve the coffee and Mayan men to play marimbas. Canada had an exhibit where they brought in native school children. So those are kind of in the north part of the fairgrounds. And if you look in the south part of the fairgrounds, you can see where the ethnological village was that Putnam organized, and it was very close to the US government Indian school. And so now the displays were kind of all over the place here. The people who came to the, and I guess I'll also point out, if you look at the very north of this map, you'll see where the so-called Esquimaux village of Inuit people from Eastern Canada was located. And I'll talk about them a little bit more in a minute. There's the Penobscot village that's part of Putnam's ethnological village. Some of the individuals, some of the tribal communities that set up villages in the ethnological village were paid. The individuals were paid. As I mentioned, the Kwakwaka'yu people from the Northwest Coast who set up their village there, the individuals were paid $20 a month to be on display and to every once in a while perform for tourists who came through. The Penobscot people were not paid. They were told they could sell arts and crafts to make a little bit of money. There were Navajo people there, Diné people from the Southwest who were supposed to be paid by the state of Colorado to live in their hogans on the grounds. And they were actually paid for half of the amount of time that they worked. And then the Colorado state government reneged on paying them the rest. So they kind of got cheated at the end. So there were several different native villages in the ethnological village, and the way that people earned money being there kind of varied from individual group to individual group. There was one really persistent entrepreneur, an Abenaki woman named Emma Reeves, who had worked at other World's Fairs in the past, and she wrote several letters trying to be able to come and set up a stand to sell her baskets and her other goods that she made. And she was rebuffed every time. So in the end, she just represented herself as an Iroquois person and joined the Iroquois village on the fairgrounds and came and sold her goods there that way. So there were all kinds of creative ways that individuals came to make a living at the fair. The Inuit village at the fair, I'm going to talk about a little bit more when I talk about people off the fairgrounds. Here's a photograph of the boarding school where native students from 6 different boarding schools were brought in at different times during the summer and did their boarding school work without being paid. And tourists came in and watched them be students in Indian boarding schools. And the idea of the federal government who organized that exhibit was that this showed what good work they were doing driving Indian culture out of Indian individuals and turning them into good Christian Americans. It's kind of a microcosm of the sordid history of boarding schools in the United States. This is a group of one of the school children who came. They all came for about 3 to 4 weeks at a time. And then some individuals actually made a living in other ways on the fairgrounds. Some Native individuals just came and worked at the fair. One was Francis Cayou, an Omaha man from Nebraska who worked as a Columbian Guard. The Columbian Guards they were basically the security force for the fair. He got a cot to stay in the guard tent, and he got paid $60 a month. And he later went on to be a very well-known individual in the early 20th century, both in his Omaha community in Nebraska and in the city of Chicago, where he was involved in kind of all kinds of works. He was also a football coach at Wabash College. For those of you from Indiana might know where that is. And he became a leader in the Chicago Indian community, but he just came to work and not as part of any of the displays. There were also some off the fairgrounds displays where people came to work. Buffalo Bill was not permitted on the fairgrounds, so he leased land outside of the fairgrounds and put on more than 600 programs. And I found all of his employees' contracts for the fair in the National Archives in DC, which outlines that they got paid transportation, room, board, medical care, and anywhere between $10 and $70 each per month to participate in the fair. All the Native employees of Buffalo Bill were hired from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. And at that time, so if you add up all the salaries that were paid during the fair, he was paying $1,890 a month to those individuals. Many of those individuals sent money home, and probably more than half of the money that they earned was sent home directly to their families to support them back on the reservation. And then the so-called Esquimaux village, which was a village of Inuit people, is a kind of an interesting case to end my talk on here because they were initially promised $50 per family per year to come not only to the fair, but to continue on for a 2-year employment period. And when they got here, well, they arrived in winter, so they were okay. They were told they had to wear their sealskin clothing. Many of them were from an area where they already generally wore cotton clothing and didn't wear sealskins. And when the weather warmed up, it was just too hot to do that, and people got sick. And the entrepreneur who brought them insisted that they continue to wear those clothes. And so then some of the individuals in that community, in that village, were kind of locked up and jailed, and they escaped from the jail, and they actually then escaped from the fairgrounds, and they left the fairgrounds. They hired an attorney. They sued in federal court under federal labor laws and won their case. And they set up their own village outside of the fairgrounds in competition with the village inside the fairgrounds. So about half the community members were outside and half were inside the fairgrounds, which caused the man who brought them to renegotiate contracts. And in the end, he agreed to pay the families $50 a month instead of $50 a year. And to improve their working conditions and not make them wear their sealskin clothing during the hot weather in Chicago in the summertime. So they virtually went on strike successfully and got a 12 times increase in their pay. Many of the Native individuals visited with each other on the fairgrounds, and it's quite likely that those, like the Inuit people and like the Indian village people on the Midway who went on strike and got their pay increased, probably found out from the employees of Buffalo Bill what they were making and went on strike for a better price. I do have a chart here that shows some of the earnings that people made during the fair. You can see that they varied greatly. Some of the individuals who didn't get paid at all participated in canoe races or swim races, and the winner would get paid. Some people got paid by the day, some people got paid by the week, some people got paid by the month. Some people's pay included room and board. I have a real kind of deep analysis of that in the book. And so what I wanted you to think about was American Indian people who came to the fair partly for adventure, but to a large degree to make a living, and how they were viewed by the outside world, but how they viewed themselves as well, and kind of how they used this as an opportunity to make money in the cash economy, and to begin to participate more fully in the cash economy, and to kind of move into the modern world in a way where they were able to do so while retaining parts of their cultural heritage that were important to them. So I think that's as far as I want to go here, because I see I've been talking for quite a long time, and open it up for questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Dave. Thank you. That was excellent. We have two questions here in the chat, actually two or three. And so I'm going to go ahead and read those. We'll start with the first, then move on to the second. And while we're talking, I'd encourage everyone in the audience, if you have a question, if there's something you'd like to know more about, please go ahead and put it in the chat now. You can message me directly or message everyone in the chat. I'll go ahead and read the first question. How does this fair continue to impact representations of natives today? For example, you mentioned that a lot of the items that were collected for the fair are used in natural history museums. So whether that or beyond that, could you talk a little bit about the impact of the fair today?
Yeah, people are really interested in representation. So I think that's a good question that probably a lot of people are interested in. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Ed. One of the things is that when these material objects were collected and then ended up in the Field Museum and kind of became the basis for the native displays in the Field Museum, all the way up until just a few years ago, the way American Indians were represented in that museum was almost purely as people of the past and of a very specific time in the past. It was supposed to be a representation of pre-Columbian American Indian history, and before Columbus, which was not accurate, because a lot of the objects that people made, they used goods that had derived from Europe in one way or another. But it kind of was intended to freeze frame Indians as people from the past, so the people who would come to the museum and look would see what used to be, right? And not what is now. Now, it's kind of interesting. I know the Field Museum in the last few years has made a real effort to begin to present modern American Indian people as part of the world we live in today. And so it's only just changing in that museum and in other museums around the country. But I think another way to think about this is in terms of kind of that representation that became so popular in that era of the beginning of the field of anthropology, that the American mindset was shaped in a way in that early period that contributed to the way that the kind of the old Western novels were written and old Western movies were made. And even if you look at Western movies that are made today, in many cases, the American Indian characters in those are not reflected as modern. There are certainly exceptions, and there are now indigenous filmmakers who are beginning to make films. But I think that that representation that was part of that time period has really carried forward kind of deeply into the modern world.
One question I have, just kind of following on that point, is I'm wondering about the buyers, the consumers of these cultural and artistic products, because In some other histories I've read, as far as I understand, there was a bit of a shift in the Western intelligentsia, the American intelligentsia, especially around the 1920s, 1930s, where uh, artistic and cultural products that were perceived as, traditional, wild, savage, non-modern, sort of became much more fashionable, right? And the kind of modern traditions seemed to be discredited by the World War and other kind of intellectual political crises of the time, and the intelligentsia was sort of embracing that which appeared to it as backward. And I'm wondering, when you look at the buyers, the market, the consumers for cultural and artistic products in this time, in the early 1890s, is the consumer here sort of an intellectual, educated, professional, intelligentsia sort of consumer, or is it more sort of a mass market consumption, working class people and so on?
Yeah, at this time period, there are kind of two groups of people who are collecting. And one is the collectors for universities and museums who are going out and buying objects, material objects, because they think that Indian culture is disappearing, and they think there's only a certain amount of material culture available, and whoever gets it is going to have it on the one hand. And if it's not collected, it's going to disappear, and that part of our history is going to go away. And then the other kind of group of collectors at this time period were more among the wealthier class, who were buying things that they thought of as exotic, and things that they, thought of as colorful, and things that would be good talking points when they held dinner parties and things like that, I think.
Right, that makes sense. And so another question we have here is, how does this knowledge overall that you presented change our understanding of the Native American experience? And also, how does it change our understanding of the world's fairs? And the questioner says also that they love this talk, so thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not the only one who's written about this. It's kind of a growing area of study, kind of looking at American Indian individuals entering into the cash economy in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But I think it's important to think of Native people as being part of the modern world at whatever time period we're looking at. And so one of the things that looking at this from a labor and an economic perspective does is makes you realize that, yes, American Indians not only participated in the modern world, but they did so in ways that many other people did, oftentimes just as savvy as other people in terms of that participation. And I think that we have a tendency, when we look at this time period in history, to think of American Indians who are living in reservation communities and not think of American Indians as traveling and working outside of reservation communities. And of course, American Indians have been traveling for thousands of years across the continent. So in some way, for trade and for economic purposes, in some ways, this is just kind of a different kind of modern continuation of that old process.
Got a question following up on that. How did money at the fair impact tribal economies and other peoples who didn't go to the fair?
Yeah, so that's a good question too. So as I mentioned, in the case of the people who worked for Buffalo Bill, they sent significant amounts of money home. And over the years, not just during the fair, but over the years when people from Pine Ridge Reservation worked for Buffalo Bill, they sent so much money home that historians and anthropologists, both tribal and non-tribal members today, look at that time period and say that was the one time period when there was a decent economy on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. More recently, it's been known for being in the the #1 poorest county in the United States of America. But during this time, because people were out making a living and getting their room and board paid and sending thousands of dollars home, they were able to support their families in ways that people in that community couldn't do later. Many of the people who worked for the fair barely made enough money to pay their expenses. They made enough money to make a living while they were at the fair. They didn't save much money and went home, but other people did save some money. The George Hunt, who I mentioned, the Kwakwaka'u man, made enough money that when he went home, he was able to put on a potlatch, which is a very important kind of social and political and religious ceremony, which is one where you have a big giveaway of gifts. And people who are able to put on those kind of events, who are already he was already part of a kind of a leadership family in the community, but it strengthened his role as a leader within the community. And it was the money he had earned working for the fair that he was able to kind of convert that to. One of the Inuit most of the Inuit people went home, and they were, after their 2 years were up, and they were just done with traveling and it was a hard way to make a living. But one of the women moved to Hollywood and brought the housing and the dog sleds and the dogs with her. And whenever Western movies featuring Esquimaux were made, she was the one who was paid to supply the movie set. And so she, in fact, one of the very first indigenous made movies back in the early 1900s, she was a part of. So there were all kinds of different experiences that people had afterwards.
Great. Well, that concludes the questions in our chat. I've got just a two-part final question for you, but I would like to invite everyone, if you have any questions that you'd like to have asked during today's event, please don't hesitate to share them in the chat. My final question, maybe some folks will have another question, but otherwise my final question is that I was really struck by your detailing Simon Pokagon and his protest tract, sort of articulating the discontent over the white settlement of Indian land, and especially the arc of that story, that led to collaboration with the mayor of Chicago. And so I'm wondering, do you see that as a political pattern? Because that story seemed very analogous to some recent experiences that are familiar to us today, this kind of articulation of discontent leading to a political relationship, a political mediation. So is that a pattern you see at this time? And also, I mean, I'm wondering if that's maybe related to another question I had, given that you're now working on a book about the 1950s federal policy of terminating the political status of tribal nations. I'm wondering sort of how, when you thought about shifting your research agenda from the World's Fair to 1950s federal policy of termination, do these themes of grounding American Indian history in the cash nexus, in the cash economy, in the material world, do those continue to play out anyway in your current research?
Yeah, thank you for those questions, Ed. In regards to the first question, I think that is a longstanding pattern for Native people to part of what Pokagon was protesting, and it's not clear from what I said, but part of what he was protesting is that the Potawatomi people, when they sold Chicago, were not fairly compensated for the lands that they sold. And even the money that they were promised in the treaty, they didn't receive all that money that the federal government had promised them. And his father, Leopold Pokagon, had actually met with Abraham Lincoln trying to get that money paid. And Simon Pokagon, as part of his argument and part of the agreement he made with the mayor, is that they were going to lobby then to get the rest of the compensation for that land that they had lost. And as I said, the mayor met an untimely death before much could come of that. But that is kind of a long-standing pattern where Native people and leaders in Native communities know very well what the federal trust responsibilities are and the federal obligations are to those communities. And when those obligations aren't being upheld, they protest them, sometimes this way by through their writings, sometimes by going and lobbying Congress, sometimes by suing in federal court. And one of the focuses of the work I'm doing now on the termination policy is the misuse of by the federal government of American Indians' tribal money, tribal funds. So there's a long, long history of the federal government misusing money, and it's not US money, it's the tribe's own money that they're misusing. And so tribes protest against this time and again, and nonetheless are in a constant situation where they have to do it over and over and over. And here in the 1950s, when the federal government decided it would be in the American interest to end the political relationship that defines the relationship between tribes in the United States, one of the methods that the federal government used was to bribe tribes when they had money that was their own money, whether they won a judgment in a lawsuit. For some tribes, when their lands were flooded by dams, the United States owed them money, and they held back, Congress held back the money, trying to use it as a bribe to get American Indian tribal nations to accept the end of that relationship and to be terminated. So that's the focus of the book I'm looking at now. And in some cases, the federal government succeeded in terminating tribal relationships, and some they didn't. But it all does have that grounding in the misuse of tribal resources and tribal money.
Excellent, thank you. And we have one final question. We'll make this the last question here, and it is as follows. You pointed out at the beginning of the lecture that Native American religion was outlawed. These expositions consisted primarily of the grass dance, which was popular and wasn't outlawed. Could you possibly explain to the rest of the audience how the expositions help preserve the dances we know today as powwows? I want to note that powwows aren't the proper term to use, it is celebrations.
Thank you for that question. There were, depending on which tribal community was part of which exhibits. So remember, there were 5 different tribal nations in the in Putnam's ethnological exhibit, and there were 3 different tribal nations represented in the Midway Plaisance exhibit, and then there were the Lakota people who were part of Buffalo Bill's exhibit. So in this particular fair, there were people from numerous tribal backgrounds, and that's a really good observation that you're making there in that question, that if those people would have performed, the performances that were viewed as performances on the fairgrounds many times were traditional dances, sometimes ceremonial dances, that if they had practiced those dances at home, they might have been arrested and thrown in jail. But here on the fairgrounds, they got paid to do it. In fact, Vine Deloria Jr., the well-known philosopher of the Lakota, of the late 20th century, one of the things he argued was that you could draw a direct line between the cultural preservation and the revitalization of cultural practices in the 1980s and 70s and 80s and 90s, and the Lakota people who had participated in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and who had kept those practices alive in places where they were permitted to and paid to, where if they'd have been at home, it would have been against the law. And that's just one example. The Kwakwaka'yu people was another example. So specific tribal dances were regularly used in these World's Fairs, not just this World's Fair, but other World's Fairs, not only as a way to make money, but as a way to hang on to some aspects of cultural preservation. And so tribal peoples from a lot of different tribal nations were able to do that in ways that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to. Of course, today's powwows are much more, are not nearly as community specific as powwows were 50 or 60 years ago, where the dances might have been much more traditionally tied to a specific community. But I think that whole idea of performance and participation in dance was kept alive by those individuals who were able to do that in places where they might not have otherwise been able to when they were at home. Yeah.
Well, with that, we'll draw the event to a close. So I want to thank all of you in the audience for asking excellent questions. I want to thank the NEIU History Department for co-sponsoring this event. And most of all, thank you, Dave, for an excellent presentation, wonderful presentation and discussion. We really appreciate it. We see a lot of words of thanks in the chat and applause icons on our audience members' screen. So thank you. Thank you again for being with us here today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really pleased to have been able to speak to you all.